Presented below is the approximately 500-word speech offered by Greta Thunberg, a 16-year-old Swedish activist, at the United Nations Climate Action Summit in September 2019, which was held only a few days after a global student-led climate protest and strike. Many sovereign governments were represented at this summit by their leaders or ambassadors, though the USA and Brazil, two of the world's major contributors to climate change, were noticeably absent. After reading the speech, construct an essay that reveals and analyzes Thunberg's rhetorical choices. This is all wrong. I shouldn't be standing here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to me for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering. People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We're in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? For more than 30 years, the science has been crystal clear. How dare you continue to look away and come here saying that you are doing enough when the politics and solutions needed are still nowhere in sight? With today's emission levels, our remaining CO2 budget will be gone in less than 8.5 years. You say you hear us and that you understand the urgency, but no matter how sad and angry I am, I don't want to believe that. Because if you fully understood the situation and still kept on failing to act, then you would be evil. And I refuse to believe that. The popular idea of cutting our emissions in half in 10 years only gives us a 50% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius, and the risk of setting off irreversible chain reactions beyond human control. Maybe 50% is acceptable to you, but those numbers don't include tipping points, most feedback loops, additional warming hidden by toxic air pollution, or the aspects of justice and equity. To have a 67% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius global temperature rise, the best odds given by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the world had 420 gigatons of carbon dioxide left to emit back in January of 2018. Today, that figure is already down to less than 350 gigatons. How dare you pretend that this can be solved with business as usual and some technical solutions? With today's emission levels, that remaining CO2 budget will be entirely gone in less than 8.5 years. There will not be any solutions or plans presented in line with these figures today, because these numbers are too uncomfortable, and you are still not mature enough to tell it like it is. You are failing us. But the young people are starting to understand your betrayal. The eyes of all future generations are upon you, and if you choose to fail us, I say we will never forgive you. We will not let you get away with this. Right here, right now is where we draw the line. The world is waking up, and change is coming, whether you like it or not. So before we go any farther, we should summarize the passage and make sure we can clarify any miscellaneous information. First, Thunberg presents some basic facts about the climate crisis and demands action from the leaders present. This passage isn't that difficult, so this summary should be fairly simple. Second, just in case you're not sure about carbon dioxide or what CO2 refers to, it's a major greenhouse gas, which is part of what causes global warming. And if you're unclear about the 1.5 degrees Celsius change that is referred to in the passage, this is about an average change over time. So the Earth's average temperature is about 15 degrees Celsius. Over the last 5,000 years, the Earth has warmed a certain amount, about 5 degrees Celsius, but only within the last 100 years has it risen nearly 1 entire degree Celsius. This is a dramatic change in the rate of temperature change, and this is one of the driving factors of global climate change. So we've read the passage, we've summarized it. The next step is capping it. condensing the elements into the four main elements that would allow us to get to the rhetorical situation. First, context. This is at a UN Climate Action Summit in late 2019. And the only other background information that you might want to kind of activate in the back of your head is the recognition of how long it has taken for people to begin to actually accept and understand the science of climate change. Audience is fairly simple here. We're not talking to everybody. We are talking very specifically to the world leaders present at this climate summit. These world leaders are adults, and they have the power to make large-scale decisions that really affect the entire world. Things that we might assume about this audience. Maybe these leaders won't listen because Greta is a young child compared to them. Perhaps even if the leaders do listen, they might not be compelled to actually do anything. Next is persona. If you can see the short accusatory sentences that Thunberg uses fairly often, you might begin to recognize that she doesn't really care about being seen as nice or as traditionally respectful. She ignores those social expectations, and that is a part of her mask that she's developing. You also might recognize that even though she uses scientific language, she also uses threats. And there's this kind of complicated, educated but ignored voice. And it creates this kind of audacious tone, a kind of challenging tone. And finally, purpose. Heart is fear. What drives her is fear, and you can see this a lot in her language, like dying, betrayal, failure, etc. In her head, the ideological fight, she wants to ensure actual action rather than talk on climate change. And when you want to get to the hands, something as specific as possible, she wants to shame the adults who have the ability to enact and enforce real-life policy decisions into saving future generations from climate change. If we were to put this together into a single coherent sentence, you might say something like, at a United Nations summit in 2019, the audacious Greta Thunberg shames a room full of ineffective world leaders into taking real policy action on climate change. Or, with climate strikes coming to a head in 2019, a rightfully angry teenager, Thunberg, delivers an impassioned speech to a United Nations panel in an effort to see real-life climate change programs enacted before our CO2 budget is gone in less than 8.5 years. So we have our rhetorical situation statement. The next step is to begin actually analyzing what we see. A good place to start is the appeals. We'll start with ethos. Ethos is the character appeal. How do I want to be perceived as the speaker, and how do I develop that mask through my language? Well, Thunberg knows that her age is going to be a problem, and so she kind of embraces that problem by using much darker words, a kind of accusatory diction like collapsing and betrayal, draw the line. And of course that develops into a much larger tone, a very kind of dark tone that you can see is explored even through relationships. Like she develops this us versus you mentality. Next up is logos, the logic of the work. And in this case, she's not really offering any particular arguments. In fact, she says outright that she's not offering solutions. And so you might want to look at this in terms of why. How does she accomplish a logical structure without really giving you any kind of major argument? Well, by simply listing blunt scientific facts, she kind of makes us realize where the burden should be. She is the one learning these facts, but she can't do anything about it. I mean, she's a teenager in school. And so the logic actually kind of informs a duty on behalf of the audience. Pathos, the emotional appeal, I think is fairly obvious in this piece, but how and to what extent and why? Using threats and accusations of dishonor are certainly very powerful in creating a sense of shame, but she also, again, develops these with an eye towards understanding the relationship between her and her audience. You wouldn't normally expect a child to deliver threats and humiliating language, so perhaps it's not just a random quirk that maybe she's just really mad, but maybe that is a strategy on her part to develop a kind of relationship between her and her audience. Next, go beyond the traditional appeals of ethos, logos, pathos, and look for any potential other strategies that might be at play here. Repetition is often used, and in this case, it's used fairly frequently. She repeats herself in a number of different places, but one of the interesting things about this repetition is that it's not for hyperbole. Remember that a hyperbole is an extreme exaggeration made for a specific point. But she's not really exaggerating anything. She's just repeating facts in a very blunt way. And that has the appearance of hyperbole without actually being hyperbole. Maybe that's something that we can talk about. Another thing to look for is juxtaposition, throwing unlike things together. And again, she does this by creating a difference and distance between us, the younger generation, and you, the adult generation. And she also plays with this juxtaposition with age. Maybe think about how those relationships work throughout the passage. And the final thing that I would kind of focus on is kind of a deeper aspect of this, but it's that she reverses empathy in a kind of ironic way. Empathy is about my ability to feel someone's emotions without being in my own frame of reference, being in somebody else's frame of reference. But she kind of twists that on its head. She wants her audience to feel like she does. She's kind of enforcing her feelings onto other people, kind of projecting empathy in this kind of reversed way. That's a pretty deep connection to make, but that can lead to some really interesting analytical development. So once we've put together some basic thoughts about what we see her rhetorical choices as, what kind of movements she's generally doing, we would want to kind of condense this into a thesis statement, kind of similar to what we did with Cap, developing it into a rhetorical situation statement. So it might look something like this. Through the use of repetitive accusations and ironic juxtapositions, Thunberg shames the attending world leaders into actually caring about the future of the planet. Or, Thunberg employs disrespectful threats, strange reversals of empathy, and fear-based repetition, so that quick action on climate change would be the inevitable response taken by world leaders. And finally, just an optional thing, as you get better at doing this, you might begin to find that you can connect the rhetorical situation statement and your thesis into a single sentence. And that might look something like this. At a United Nations summit in 2019, the audacious Greta Thunberg shames a room full of ineffective world leaders into taking real policy action on climate change through the use of disrespectful threats, ironic juxtapositions, and fear-based repetition. All right, so we've read our passage, we've summarized it, we've capped it and developed a rhetorical situation statement, we've analyzed it and developed a thesis. Now the final step is actually writing an essay. For short rhetorical analysis essays like this, the kind that you might expect to see on an AP exam, you really don't need any kind of fluffy language or an imaginative hook. Remember that you want to think about these kinds of essays as teaching tools. So get to the point. Here's what ours might look like. With climate strikes coming to a head in 2019, a rightfully angry teenager, Thunberg, delivers an impassioned speech to a United Nations panel in an effort to see real-life climate change programs enacted before our CO2 budget is gone in less than 8.5 years. To achieve this goal, Thunberg employs disrespectful threats, strange reversals of empathy, and fear-based repetition, so that quick action on climate change would be the inevitable response taken by world leaders. Now, for body paragraphs, the meat of your essay. There's lots of different strategies and structures for how to do this, but in the interests of tutoring you and giving you a couple of strategies to practice, here's two. One is to make your body paragraphs mirror the passage chronologically and hit your thesis points in the organic order that they appear. This tends to be a little bit easier for students. It feels a little bit more natural. You're starting at the beginning, then you talk about the middle, and then you get to the end. But the problem is that this can sometimes seem a little bit random and disconnected if you aren't very clear and deliberate about making connections. The other type would be to create idea-driven paragraphs rather than chronologically driven paragraphs, so that each paragraph is kind of one part of your thesis and you make connections across all parts of the passage. This is a little bit more of an advanced skill. It's a little bit more complicated to do because each paragraph requires a lot more connection, but it also tends to lead to a much more developed and nuanced analysis. Let's take a look at the first type. Here's an example of a first paragraph, a potential first paragraph, using this kind of chronological thinking. As Thunberg begins, she doesn't offer scientific facts or potential solutions to climate change. Instead, she challenges why she is present in the first place. By incredulously asking, "You all come to me for hope?" she forces her audience to see how their positions should in fact be reversed. A child being asked to save the adults is unreasonable, and Thunberg's shameful speech begins to reveal the ironies of having a child speak at a summit like this at all. Multiple sentences go by that only exist to exaggerate and reinforce this irony by repeating, "How dare you?" and offering tonally dark language like, "You have stolen my dreams." She prevents the attending world leaders from dismissing her and forces them into acknowledging their own lack of action. Compare that with this second type of reasoning, this second structure, where you kind of tackle it as an idea rather than chronologically. Fear-based repetition is a hallmark of Thunberg's speech. While "how dare you" is repeated often at the beginning, this accusation evolves into "we will never forgive you" by the end of the speech. The first statement implies shame, yes, but it is rather simplistic because it offers no consequence attached to it. The last statement, however, offers a deeper critique through the implied addition of an entire generation of people, rather than one person wagging their finger, as well as a future consequence that history will judge the adults' generation harshly. This cycle of simple repetition leading to deeper consequences can also be seen with the move from her reference of 8.5 years to "young people are starting to understand your betrayal." And finally, your conclusion. Now, the idea of repeating your thesis or just summarizing your idea is actually kind of an incorrect way of thinking about conclusions. That's really boring and it doesn't really help you. It's kind of just a useless repetition. So instead, your conclusions should be thinking about the future. The questions "so what" and "now what" kind of make you recognize that there's value to what you've done. Your analysis and your essay is a teaching tool. So the conclusion should kind of wrap up that teaching tool and make you think about, or make the audience rather, think about how your analysis can be useful and valuable in the future. An example might look like this. Children threatening adults may, on the surface, seem like the tantrums of ignorance. But Thunberg shows us that these kinds of threats can be driven by an informed view of the world and may reveal some deep ironies that even adults cannot see. If her speech doesn't motivate world leaders to action, it can at least give confidence to other children who have been silenced by the expectations of their age.